If you are preparing for a VBAC, I have put together a free guide to help you in your preparation. It's called Preparing for a VBAC, your first three steps to an empowered birth experience. This guide will walk you through the first three steps that you need to make on your VBAC preparation journey, and it'll make the whole process a lot easier and more straightforward for you. So if you want to grab that guide, go to thehannahgill.com/first steps. Again, that is thehannahgill.com/first steps. Hey there. I am so excited for today's guest. We have Alexis Adams, and she is the CEO and therapist at Confidently Therapy. In addition to running a thriving mental health practice, she is a wife and mom to three young kids. Through her unique blend of personal experience and clinical expertise, Alexis specializes in helping anxious, perfectionist moms find confidence, calm, and connection, not just in parenting, but in their overall lives. For Alexis, parenthood is often the catalyst that brings clients to her practice, yet the work she guides them through reaches beyond parenting, creating transformation at a deep core level. Alexis holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. Her passion for supporting parents led her to complete advanced training in perinatal mental health with Postpartum Support International, where she also volunteers as a group facilitator and care coordinator. Alexis is passionate about helping parents build confidence from within, beyond their parenting roles. She has been featured on several other podcasts and speaking engagements where she shares insights and strategies for navigating parenthood's unique challenges while prioritizing inner growth and self-awareness. I'm your host, Hannah Gill, and this is Motherhood Flow. Hi, Alexis. Thank you so much for being on the show today. Welcome. Can you give me a little bit of a background about you and how you got into the work that you're doing?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me. I am Alexis. I am a therapist, and I am in that space of working with moms and parents, specifically anxious, perfectionist moms, helping them to build confidence and calm. And so I got into that work because I personally can relate to that. I am a type A perfectionist even before parenthood. And then I thought I would be able to go into parenthood completely prepared, have everything, be on top of everything. And my world was rocked. And so that has really led me into this space, knowing how much motherhood can kind of complicate things. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but just can complicate things, magnify things, that sort of thing. So,
Awesome. So one of the big topics of discussion that we had talked about discussing today, and something that's really important for my audience, is the ability to set boundaries, and not just to want to set boundaries, but to actually hold those boundaries and the feelings surrounding setting boundaries. So could we kind of go into why? Because what I found with a lot of my clients is like there's a lot of difficulty with actually setting those boundaries. Like they can communicate to me the boundaries they want to set, but actually implementing that and setting those boundaries is really difficult. So why do you feel like there is such it's so difficult for women, especially mothers, to set their own boundaries and to hold them?
so that's many layers to that question. So I'm going to kind of break it down if that's okay. So a few different things of one, and this is, call it what it is, but a lot of the times I feel like women in particular are conditioned to make everyone else comfortable, read the room, and kind of temperature check with all of that, right? And to match the temperature and kind of keep it even keel. Even a conversation with family over the holidays, that became very apparent of like how we are programmed as women in particular. Not to say men don't feel those same pressures, but in general, I have found that it's more common in women. So that has been kind of running through your blood even before you become a parent, that you just need to make everybody else comfortable, which makes it really hard to address conflict. Then you add on top of that this perspective of what conflict, and I say that in air quotes here, what conflict is. And a lot of the times, what we fear is that if we communicate something that somebody else doesn't agree with, something that somebody else might push back on, we're going to come up into some conflict. And a lot of times, what women envision as Conflict is they'll stuff everything down until they can't stuff it anymore. And then it comes into this big, like, explosion, sort of all out brawl. Maybe it's just me, but I doubt that's true. And so then they've got this image of conflict being this big, ugly thing that breaks up relationships apart and that sort of idea. And so when you're carrying that, as well as this narrative of everybody has to like me, everybody has to be comfortable, it's my responsibility and I can't fail, that becomes really, limiting in how you address conflict, how you address those communication and conversations. So those would be the two biggest elements, I would say, when it comes to addressing conflict and what gets in the way.
So I love that you brought up like the idea of conflict, because I think, like you said, we as women think setting a boundary is going to cause an argument or cause a fight, or we're worried about not being liked or someone getting upset with us. But setting a boundary doesn't have to be like like you said, it doesn't have to create that conflict. It's just a boundary. It's not you lashing out at somebody saying like, you can't do this, or here's my boundary. It's just setting a boundary. It's just part of your rights and your personal space, and
Yeah.
what you need to have peace in your life and have structure in your life. And that is okay. It doesn't have to be like this big conflict, like you said, like an argument. So when it comes to, like, let's say specifically in the birth space or
Mm-hmm.
pregnancy, and one of the biggest things I see is that, for example, women may have a birth plan and they really want to be able to have those boundaries set within their birth plan. Not saying that like, oh, my birth has to go this specific way or everything is just
Yeah.
awful, but just a way to communicate boundaries to providers. So do you feel like there is a better way to set those boundaries and have those conversations and clear communication with health providers in the birth space to make it easier for women?
So I have a few ideas on that topic particularly. One is using your like prenatal appointments as the dating of your provider, to be honest. Because if you don't feel comfortable then talking about these difficult conversations, whether that's, refusing XYZ or advocating for XYZ, then you're not going to feel comfortable when you're in your most vulnerable state of birth. So use your appointments as dating process. And it is okay for you to say, hey, you know what? This isn't a right fit. I mean, I even noticed that in therapy spaces, right? And there's no difference between a therapy space and, a medical provider space. Like, you have to like who you're liking. It doesn't say anything about them. It just is, how are we going to work together? How do our personalities match? So first and foremost would be to use those prenatal appointments as the dating process. The second piece would be, I'm a big advocate for having support in the birthing space so that you can focus on you and your baby and getting the job done, so to speak, right? But like having somebody else who can be there and advocate for you. I wish I had known more about doulas prior to having my own children. It wasn't until after my last was born that I learned more about what a role of a doula is. But having somebody who can say, this is what she's asked for, this is what they're wanting, those sorts of conversations, so that it's not all on you, because you're going to be, exhausted, distracted, and all of that. And you shouldn't have to, quote unquote, fight for yourself in those processes too. So I'm big on finding your support people that are going to have your back in those moments.
And I love that you mentioned that, because there's a lot of women who want doulas, a lot of women who don't want doulas for whatever reason. And like, as type A women and mothers, like, we are generally doing all the research, all the planning, and looking up everything about birth and postpartum and all of that. And usually our partners are not. So if for some reason you don't want a doula or can't afford a doula or whatever that may look like, educating your partner on those things too, so they can be your advocate, is so important. And my doula even helped like support my partner and my husband in most things. And I feel like a lot of husbands as well and partners don't feel confident advocating either. So it's not just like the mother that doesn't feel confident setting those boundaries. It's also the support person. So I feel like getting them educated on all that as well. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're watching a documentary or reading a research article or listening to a podcast, like send it to your partner and have them be educated on it as well and have those conversations, especially with a birth plan, because that can help them know how to advocate too when you're not in the mindset to do so.
Absolutely. And I think one thing, so my husband didn't pick up a baby book once, ever, at all. I was in the nose of every single thing, feeding, sleeping, all of the things. And so I can say from experience, it's not essential, but education does absolutely empower someone. The other piece would be, communicating kind of on that line of communicating your boundaries. I mean, communicating what makes that so important for you, right? Like, okay, we can't have a dual up, but I'm not going to be in a capacity to have to advocate for myself. And so you having this information, you being on the same page for me feels like support to me, right? So getting very down to the bones or down to the frames of why you're asking them to read those articles, why you're asking them to do those courses, whatever it is. Because a lot of the times, at least in my experience with working with couples in particular, is you pass the information along and you're like, read this, but they don't have any context. And a lot of times, and this is to no fault by any means, but people think things differently because of their lived experiences. So I know my husband didn't see it that important that we know how to form a latch and like have safe sleep and all of those things, right? To me, those were the most essential things, right? So everybody's perspective helps them to see things differently. And so you have to say explicitly why this is important to you. It's not your responsibility necessarily to carry them on your back and bring them along with you on everything and spoon feed them information. But it is important for you to say, this is important to me because XYZ.
I do. I like that because them knowing your why is so important because like you said, they're not mind readers. They don't understand why it may be important to you
Mm-hmm.
because it doesn't seem as important to them. So for like my situation specifically, my husband didn't really understand like why it was so important to me to have a feedback. He was just like, okay, that's fine. But he didn't understand like the importance until I really explained it to him and was clear about my previous birth experience. So I do agree that completely being very explicit and clear in our communication, which isn't always the case. We just think like, oh, people think like us and they don't. So being very clear is important.
And I think kind of going back to the original conversation, right? Like this idea of communication and boundary setting, we make so many assumptions because we are in our heads every day, all day, and we see the world as, a certain way, but not, you're right. Like not everybody sees it that way and no one's a mind reader. And I will say that, we've been fed the lies of fairy tales that if they know, they're going to be able to just swoop in and know exactly what we need when we need it. Well, that's not happening. We're not Hallmark. Like it's not going to work that way. And so you have to lay it out and maybe it takes the sexy out of it, but wouldn't you rather have your needs met than, having them guess and get it wrong? And so being very explicit about what you need, even if it seems obvious to you, it's more important that you get your needs met.
And that brings up a really important point because one of the things I talk to with a lot of my students and clients, so a lot of women are worried about being a quote unquote difficult patient if they push back and set boundaries or question their provider or bring up what they want and need. And I always try to mention to them that I would rather be perceived as a difficult patient by setting these boundaries than than removing my boundaries and being more vulnerable and listening to like just what my provider says and not thinking about my own needs and then regretting that in the future. Like I don't want to have that regret of not setting my boundaries and holding those, like just so I'm not labeled as a difficult patient type of thing.
Yes. I think you're actually kind of segueing perfect into a topic that I'm really passionate about in general, and that is this idea of like how emotions really dictate everything. A lot of people think that they're very progressive when it comes to emotions. Like, I know how to handle emotions, I know how to accept my emotions, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's a lie. We're never, perfect at emotions, and there's emotions that hang us up a little bit. And so, a lot of the times, that fear, that discomfort, that uncertainty of, oh, I'm going to be labeled this way, that's an emotional discomfort. And you have to soothe yourself through that emotional discomfort and say, feelings aren't facts. They are one piece of this bigger puzzle. they matter. I don't need to invalidate myself. I don't need to rationalize why I'm not or am this difficult patient. They matter, but also what do you get to choose to do with them? I'm allowed to be scared and choose to advocate anyway. And so it's kind of seeing it in that perspective, because I don't know that our brains allow us to go to that place of, well, I don't want to live with regret, as much as it is kind of here in the moment, in the now of this sucks and I don't want it to suck anymore. So our brain wants us to be comfortable. Our brain wants to do the automatic thing that keeps us safe, and that it knows to do. And if you've been used to people pleasing, if you've been used to making everybody comfortable, that's going to be your autopilot. And so it's going to feel like you're wrong or bad or doing something that's not, right, because you're doing something different. You're doing something new, but it is the most authentic version of yourself to advocate those things, to set those boundaries.
And why do you feel like the emotional side of it is so like elevated and amplified when we are going through not just birth and pregnancy and birth, but just motherhood in general? Like, why do you feel like the emotional ties of really having this communication and setting your boundaries are so much more intense, or they feel more intense?
I think it probably could vary in for each person, but in my personal experience and with a lot of the clients I see is that motherhood has a tendency to magnify everything, right? Not only are you like opening yourself up to this person that you may not have yet met, right? Because they may not be earthside yet. And you love them so deeply, and it's very scary and joy filled and all the things when you're loving on this human. But then it opens all these other doors of there's so much fear and there's so much unknown and uncertainty. And if that's not been a strength for you, or if you've learned how to kind of keep that silenced and in the back of your pocket for a long time, it brings it all to the surface and you can't hide from it anymore, because now there's new responsibilities, new pressures, new expectations that you're also balancing, even in the prenatal space, not just after they're born. And so I would say that you also are kind of reparenting yourself in a lot of ways. The way that you were treated as a kid, even if it wasn't the worst of the worst, there's still always improvements we can make to our parents. And so you're being confronted with those challenges, those situations, those experiences again in new light with a big adult brain versus the little kid brain that you had before. And that's going to bring things up. That's going to make it different for you. And it's impactful.
So how can like these anxious type A women go from being anxious and type A to like you're going to completely transform overnight? But how can you start the process of being more calm and intentional and really being able to set your boundaries and kind of let go of that I need to have control and everything needs to go perfectly all the time? How can we slowly start to make that transition? Because I am myself in that transition.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, not to make a plug, but like work with me because that's exactly what my program does. I also have a few freebies that I would be willing to share too, related to the well being of postpartum prep versus like the standard buy this, do that class kind of thing. And then I also have a letting go of perfection situation that I'm more than happy to share. But if we're going back to like basics of what you can do in this moment, as soon as this podcast is off, it is really becoming familiar with yourself, because if you don't know what's happening underneath the surface, if you lump it into these big categories of, oh, I'm anxious, oh, I'm a perfectionist, then you're not really getting to the layers that actually exist within those umbrellas. And there are layers that exist within those umbrellas. What are you telling yourself about your anxiety? What are you telling yourself about yourself, your feelings, your thoughts? Are you constantly talking yourself out of what you feel, because then it's not going to feel safe to feel those things? Are you, making priority to everyone else's needs and not your own? So awareness is the foundation of everything. Even in my own work, that's where we start. And from there, it is about soothing those things that you're now becoming aware of. It's saying, I'm going to change the relationship with you so that I can change the response to you. So kind of breaking down an example, right? This idea of all the what ifs that play in your head as a mom, um, which causes this anxiety. But you're telling yourself that what I feel anxious over, I need to fix, I need to take control over. It's all on me. Those are the narratives that you're playing. So when you come to bring those to the surface, when you start to become aware of the narratives you're playing, then you can say, all right, my feelings aren't facts. That's a way to soothe yourself. You can breathe through those. You can slow processes down so that you're actually saying, you know what? This doesn't require action for me right now. This is one of the things I'm allowed to be scared of. And it's okay that I'm scared because this is really important. And I'm going to choose to just let things happen as they're meant to happen.
So you bring up awareness and reflection. And one thing that I've found, and let me know what your opinion on this is that so many women don't even take the first steps of self-reflection or becoming aware of, or like doing more deep inner work. What do you think is holding them up from taking those steps of even reflecting on themselves, their emotions, their actions? What do you think that hang up there is?
So, going from a brain stance, your brain is designed to make you safe and comfortable. It is designed to work efficiently. And so, if it worked for you in the past, it's going to work for you again. Our brain lumps things together and just kind of keeps chugging on. We aren't going to allow ourselves to touch in the pain that might exist under, what we've been doing. So if we're afraid to kind of confront ourselves, because what if I don't like the person that I am? What if, this person isn't successful unless I'm doing all the things, unless I'm overly busy? What if this person isn't likable and I'm actually as mean as I think I am, right? So it's all those what ifs that hide underneath the surface that we're scared to kind of confront. And so then we jump on this hamster wheel that makes us feel like we're in control because then we don't have to deal with it. So it's usually less scary than you think it is. There's a children's book that I've had since I was in grad school. It was an essential read for my son when we had him. He's my first. It was essential that we bought it for him. And it is called What to Do with a Problem. And I love it because not only it's a great message for kids, but I would say even for those who have this anxious heart like me, of we're constantly running away from things, building them up and allowing them to be built up to bigger than they actually are. We play it in our heads so much that it just gets bigger and bigger until we don't want to face it anymore. When actually, if we just dove in, ate the frog, as the phrase goes, we usually would find out that it's not as scary as we've made it out to be. But it's when it gets beat around in our head that it's the scariest. And this book kind of talks about that. It illustrates it, it talks about it in kid terms, but I truly I will keep that book. I won't give it to my son. I will
And
keep that book.
what's the title again? Because it sounds like my son and me need this.
It's called What to Do with the Problem.
Okay.
And it's actually, there's 4 books within this series. Like they don't build on each other, but they're picture books. So there's like What to Do with an Idea, What to Do with a Problem, and then there's 2 others that I can't, or one or 2 others that I
What
can't think
age
about. But yeah,
range are they good for?
um, I mean, I'm 31 and I think it's really fantastic. And my son was a newborn when we started reading it. So I think there's never a time when you can't benefit from a picture book, because a lot of the times our big adult brains think we, make things way more complicated than they need to be.
Yeah, sometimes you just need to
So
simplify to understand.
simplify it, make it an image, like put some pretty colors on it, and we're good. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really good story. And to be honest, that's the thread that really goes through a lot of this work, is you have to kind of face it head on, be scared and do it anyway. You're allowed to be uncomfortable with having those difficult conversations. You're allowed to be uncomfortable with setting those boundaries. You're allowed to be uncomfortable in these new things because they're new. At one point, everything was new to you, and you face those fears and move forward. And so kind of using that same strategy with the conversations you're having in the birthing space, with the conversations you're having with in-laws who are visiting too frequently, or friends who aren't showing up at all. Like those are the conversations. It's okay to be uncomfortable.
I think I love that you said it's okay to be uncomfortable, because since having my first son, my first birth experience, I've definitely become like just okay with feeling what I'm feeling, okay with feeling fear or sadness or discomfort, and not trying to fight it and push back. And I think
Mm-hmm.
part of that was preparing for my second birth, of like surrendering to the process and the discomfort of labor and all of that. And it's really carried over into me as a mother, and just it's okay to feel these emotions and what you're feeling. And discomfort is okay. We don't have to be in like this pretty pink bubble of like happiness all the time. It's okay to be uncomfortable, especially when it comes to our relationships with other people. And it's okay to have difficult and uncomfortable conversations when we're trying to set those boundaries that are important, not just for our mental health, but our family's mental health and well-being as well. So where can people find you if they want to work with you, figure out more about your programs? I will link everything in the show notes, but you can say it here as well.
Yeah, perfect. So you can find me on Instagram at confidently.therapy. And then I also have a website, confidentlytherapy.org. With the website, I post blog posts and things like that that share a little bit more long form kind of on these sorts of topics. Instagram only gives me, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, whatever it is nowadays. So I'm definitely more long-winded than that. And then those would be kind of the two biggest ways to connect, would be either the website or Instagram. And you can always kind of shoot me a message if you found this helpful, or if there's any questions. I really love conversations just in general about this topic because I am so passionate about it. So yeah, that would be the great place to connect.
I do have a lot of local Indiana listeners as well. So do you take clients in person, or is everything just virtual right now?
Everything is virtual, and here's why, actually, because when I'm working with parents, one of the biggest things that I find is we have all these excuses as to why not to put ourselves on that, docket of priorities. We're quick to schedule all the things for our kids, but not ourselves. And so I want to eliminate as many of your objections and resistance as possible. And one of those things is, well, I don't have childcare and I don't have time. And I've really made that not an option because one, it's all virtual. So you literally can walk into your kitchen or, for goodness sakes, in your closet, I don't care. And we can have a meeting. Two, I have more of a non-traditional approach to therapy in general. And I have messaging support, which actually gets my clients results faster because you're not limited to those 45-minute calls, once every month or once every week or whatever. You actually can get that support in real time of, hey, I am freaking out in my head about having this conversation with my husband because he's, not stepping up. I'm carrying all the load, blah, blah, blah. And we can talk about in the moment of like, okay, so what are the beliefs that are coming up? And what do we need to kind of tell ourselves in those moments so that we can address those conversations in the moment and not allow them to build to this big, ugly thing. And so I noticed that my clients get a lot of their results faster because we're not just waiting on, well, whenever you show up is when we're going to meet. It's getting you through the program quickly. So
I love that real-time support. That is so beneficial, especially when you have like you're spiraling and you're just like, I need someone to talk to now, not next week at 2:00 for my appointment.
Well, and think about how many things happen between, 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. for a mom. Like you've lived 4 lives by that time, right? Because I don't know about your kids, but my kids are early risers. I begged them to stay until at least 6, but 5 a.m. was the wake up call, I think, yesterday. So it's like you have lived 3 lives in that time frame, and there's so much that can happen in those 2 weeks that it's like, I don't even remember. This was a big issue, but I don't remember what it was. And so now we're moving on to this thing that's not even relevant to like the deeper core stuff. So yes, absolutely. That's why I designed what I did, because I wanted that support myself.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Alexis, for being here. I really appreciate it. Again, I will link everything in the show notes so everyone can find you. This is a topic that just needs to be talked about more, and there needs to be more awareness and education on it. So I love the work you're doing.
I love that you're having this conversation too, because it is such an important element of parenting. So thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it.
You just finished another episode of Motherhood Flow. For more, head over to thehannahgill.com or on Instagram at thehannahgill. As a reminder, this podcast is provided to you for educational and entertainment purposes only. It should not be considered a substitute for medical advice. Until next time, keep flowing.